joining us. Thank you so much for making the time today to be with us and our dynamic panel of educators and leaders. We have with us a principal from New Jersey, equity director from Harlem, professor and mathematician in New York, but also working nationally and internationally. So we're giving everybody another minute to join. I want to say welcome, welcome, welcome. And thank you so much for making time with us today. So I'm Dr. Selma Bartholomew. I'm president and owner of Legacy Pathways. I'm honored to have this continued conversation with our community leaders in the webinar series that we've been doing. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do subscribe, and also thanks in advance for hitting the like button. Today is our conversation around family and community engagement. And at the heart of this discussion for us today is the question, how are the children? As I'm certainly, as everyone, we're quarantined. I'm in New York, and other parts of the country might be in phase 1 or phase 2. But we are well aware that not just nationally, but internationally, the world has paused. There was a pause today for the services of Brother George Floyd, and to honor his life and to honor his legacy and to celebrate and to have this homegoing today. As I thought about it, I think most people are certainly thankful to have such an outpouring of love and support. And as we think about this conversation today, I want to preface it with a context around this idea of being in place. And what I mean by that is, as adults, right, you feel in place. You should feel in place because of the love you've been given, the care that you've been given, so that you can then care for others. And so many of our children, as well as adults, feel out of place and feel out of place. So as we see what's happening in the world today, yes, we are, right, encouraged and hopeful about the show of support, right, for Black Lives Matter, for our children. But I don't want to take for granted of what's really the messaging that our children may be getting, right? The fact that here's this life who, a person who had to give their life to change the world. And I'm an adult, and so as a child, I think that would make me feel almost definitely out of place. So as we engage in this conversation today, I just want to say to everybody, thank you for joining us. I have the pleasure, let me take a moment to introduce our panel and give them the chance to welcome you and to introduce themselves. I'm going to start off with a dear colleague, Principal Aleya Shoieb. She is in New Jersey and has had more than 17 years of experience and expertise working from teacher to leader. She worked with Jersey Public Schools, Jersey City Public Schools. She's now at the principal at Rahway Elementary School in Rahway, New Jersey. And she also has viewers from Canada who is joining us today. So we are actually going international today for this webinar. So Principal Shoieb, as I give you a moment to introduce yourself and to give a context, if you can in your introduction, give us a sense of how are you and how are the children in Rahway, and then I'll do the other panels members.
Oh, I just had to unmute myself. How is everyone? Welcome, welcome. My name is Aleya Shoieb, and I am the proud principal of Franklin Elementary School in Rahway, New Jersey. I am super excited to be joining my colleagues today for this panel discussion. When we talk about how are the children, that's a very, very heavy question. One that I'm asking myself every day as a parent and then also as an educator. I know from an educator's point of view, I think about all of our children, the students in my building who are now virtual, right? Checking in with those students and those families weekly, daily to see how they're doing, as well as my own 2 children at home. I have 2 children, Ryan and Rihanna, an 8th grader as well as a 4th grader. So checking in with them also daily in reference to their, just emotionally, like, how are you feeling? What do you think about virtual learning? Is this something that you want to continue? And then also having those same similar conversations with my families and my students at school as well as my teachers.
Thank you, Principal Shoieb. It is a hard question. It is a hard one, and that's why we're here, is to have those authentic conversations and to go deep at the issues and get to the heart of it. I have the next pleasure of introducing Equity Director Angel Martinez, and she is the Equity Director for the Harlem Renaissance Education Pipeline and works in collaboration with Dr. Sandy Johnson and Ms. Cynthia Williams, who was on our panel last week on May 28th. With us. And Angel Martinez, she is definitely this advocate for parents and parent engagement. She's got her degree in Massachusetts, but then you were also in California, if I'm correct, and came to New York in 2010. And so you have this, bi-coastal view of parental engagement and this bi-coastal view of different cultures and really thinking about the needs of our families and our children. So I'm honored to have Equity Director Martinez with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me let her introduce herself. And yes, we're going to ask you the hard question. How are the children?
Hi, thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be on this panel with like-minded people. Doesn't happen very often for me. I'm doing well today. I have a lot of optimism, perspective and outview, so I'm doing very well right now. And I owe that to you guys from our previous conversation. From jumping in. But I will say, the kids are not all right. And I think that having these very big conversations with them is so necessary. And I'm starting to see that us as adults are having more of a problem having and initiating the conversation than they do. Mm-hmm. I think that they are a lot more prepared and they're a lot more emotionally intelligent than we give them credit for. Mm-hmm. And that it's bringing up for me how ill prepared I am and just having to be courageous and take that step right along with them, because I feel like they're ready and I feel like they're activated in these times, and it's us as adults who have to catch up with them.
Excellent. I so agree. Thank you. And you're also a mom, yes?
Yes, so I should mention that because that is my biggest qualifier for this work. I am a mom of 3. I have my daughter Larissa, who's in 6th grade going to 7th. I have a high school senior on my hands and a high school junior, my son Seth, and my senior is my daughter Chloe.
Okay, congratulations to Chloe. Congratulations. Thank you so much for joining us. And yes, I know, like I said, it is a complex question and we have to be honest about it. We have to be able to recognize, even though we'd like to say we're all in the same boat, I always like to be able to say what you're dealing with as a mom and what your child is dealing with is unique, right? And in order for them to be able to navigate, they have to be able to first say what is it that what their challenges are. I'm honored to have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Terrence Blackman. Dr. Blackman is a professor at Medgar Evers College. He is a mathematician. Also, I'm honored to say he's have a member of our Legacy Pathways team, and just a rich history of working on behalf of community, working on behalf of engaging young people, even though he is a mathematician, but really thinking about this vision for STEM and what does it mean to create a space of equity for each and every single child. Dr. Blackman, welcome, and let me ask you, how are you and how are the children as you introduce yourself?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Bartholomew, and good afternoon, colleagues on the panel. Good afternoon to your viewers and listeners. I suppose I'm well, but I am, if I were to respond frankly, I am still, I am a bit troubled. I see, I think I've seen a future that has been unfolded for us in terms of the way in which the effects of the coronavirus across various communities, in our families. And I think that, it has caused me to have a certain sense of resolve, kind of understanding that, we have a really, really big job in front of us, and we have to think really deeply about how we carry out that job in a rigorous fashion. I mean, you asked about the children, like my colleagues on the panel. I have two kids, but they're 10 years apart, so I see them differently. One is a 7th grader, and the other is getting ready to start medical school in the fall. So he's actually, just starting some of his, pre-work for the first year. So, as I have watched both of them, he's a young Black man, and I feel more in the moment of George Floyd and what we're also seeing. I feel a certain sense of not fear, but a heightened sense of concern that I didn't feel a few days ago. He's going to the Touro Medical School, and he's here in New York, and so he's on the trains, and in a very normal way, and we see how very normal interactions can lead to things that are completely beyond our imagination.
Yeah.
So this is a concern for me, and I'm certain that this is that whether we have conversations as father and son, but I can also sense his I can sense his mood in this moment also. So I think we do have that. I mean,
Yes.
On the other end of the spectrum, I have a daughter who's in the 7th grade, and so she has been cooped up in her room for a good number of days. But maybe, and when you're in the 7th grade and 13, maybe you like to be cooped up in your room and not have so much
with a phone,
with a phone and a computer,
yes.
and maybe. But I worry about that too.
Absolutely.
I worry about those kinds of growing up interactions where they're constantly being mediated by digital technology, and the ways in which we're losing something that is some of the intimacy that comes to our in-person relationship. So, and I worry about are we ready for the fall? I mean, do I want to send my daughter to school in the fall? So so we're in this moment where I think we've seen the work that we have to do going forward. We realize now that it is a very difficult job. It's not an easy job. We see how challenging it is, and I would say that I'm resolved, and I'm trying to get other people to see that, look, we have a job to do, and we have to buckle down and do it. And if we don't do it, we're not going to turn this corner in as effective a manner as we should.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Blackman. For those who are joining us, welcome to our community conversations with leaders. We have Principal Aleya Shoieb, Equity Director Angel Martinez, and Dr. Terrence Blackman with us. Thank you so much. And once again, I remind you to subscribe and to like the channel as we engage in this discussion. And you're absolutely right, Dr. Blackman. It's okay to say that we're unsettled. When I talked about being in place and feeling out of place, right? What is happening? It almost like as if you're coins in a box, right? And this world is kind of shaking you up a little bit, and you have to, recognize that in terms of, if we're feeling that way, that our children are also feeling that way. I want to begin with this question of equity and what does it mean to us in this space, or even what it's not for you. I'm going to ask Principal Shoieb if you can maybe start, because I know that you as a leader, right, were charged with doing this work around equity within our classrooms. But what does it mean to you as you think about it? Or what is it not? I'm okay with that too, if you want to respond to that as we begin this discussion around how are the children.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. B. So for me, equity really means that we are ensuring that we are addressing the needs of every child. And that might look different for each child that we are interacting with. So really, when I think about, our current climate and situation, right now we're virtual, right? And for some children, they need that one-to-one interaction with their teacher. And so I do know that some of my teachers, they will set up private Google Meets with 1 or 2 students in order to check in. Some of our parents, because we need to include the parents in this conversation as well, in terms of what types of support are our parents providing their children at home, and that will look very different. So if we continue to build relationships and communicate with our families, we will know what their home life is like. And that piece of it is very important, because when we think about equity, every child's situation is very different. So when I hear from my families that they're going through a hardship, whether it be an economic hardship, whether it be an illness in the family. I mean, many of our families are experiencing a family member who may have contracted COVID. My expectation for that child is going to differ from another. I'm going to be a little bit more, how do I say, not expectation. The expectations are the same, but my empathy, the way I might manage that family will be different. Okay, so let me be clear to say that. The expectation is always the same, but the way in which I manage how I work with that family will be different. So giving a little extended time on assignments, checking in a little bit more often, a personal phone call, maybe even a drive-by. Their house, you know, because that's a reality. Yeah, I might not be able to hug you right now, but I'm giving you a virtual hug, and I might do a drive-by to just check in and wave and say hello. One family might need that, and another family might not. They might need something different. So
thank you.
That's how we are looking at equity.
Thank you. Thank you. And I love the idea you mentioned relationships, right? You can't do it if you don't talk about relationships. Equity Director Martinez. So this is the work that you are engaged in and charged with in Harlem Renaissance Education Pipeline. So what does that work look like for you within Harlem Renaissance Education Pipeline in this period, in this time period?
Yes, hi. So, so I think that just exactly as Aleya said as well, you know, equity is really attending to the individual needs of the students. And it's also creating a system or putting a system in place that ensures educational success for the student. I will build it out and say what it is not is focusing on one area and then feeling like you're being equitable by focusing like solely on restorative justice, solely on cultural responsiveness, and solely on disproportionality. I think that if you build it out in an equitable way or with an equitable lens or with an equity lens, then what you get is a system that is actually meeting the needs of a child or ensuring success in that way. So I will throw that in there to say what it is not as well.
Thank you so much. I'm going to use the example of the fact that I hear the ice cream truck and behind my scene because, right, we're all Zooming from home and things like that. What it's not is deciding that everybody will get ice cream. You know, everybody will get chocolate favorite ice cream every single day and thinking, right, that we all like chocolate ice cream and nobody necessarily taking the time to get to know me and say, well, I don't want chocolate ice cream. I might be allergic to chocolate ice cream. And so it's really important that when we think about equity and when we think about engaging our families, that we take the time to know who they are. I also want to say that sometimes it's a little scary to have that word in the education space because it sounds so busy and so chaotic to say, oh, I have to focus on Jason, I have to focus on Maria, I have to this, right? So you have to build relationship and engagement. But what we talk about as a company is that you also need systems and structures. You need structures to be able to, right, have kids working, right? So that's why we do a math notebook. That's why we do things pedagogically like cold calling so that no one, right, gets left out. So if you have structures in place pedagogically within your classroom and structures in place within your building and also within your family, we're going to get to the family piece, right? Then yes, you can meet the needs of each and every child and make them feel very special. And I'm going to go back, make them feel in place because the box, right? The coin box of kind of like life beating up on us is constantly happening. Dr. Blackman, in this context of equity, can you talk a little bit about your current research around COVID-19 and communities of color and what the data is saying and make that connection for us about why equity is so important at this stage?
Yeah, so one of the things, you know, recently I was part of a hackathon at MIT, which had to do with kind of just ideating solutions around how do we support vulnerable populations. And as part of that job, as part of that work, I really kind of zoned in on the coronavirus rates, death rates in New York City. And so what we find is that if we were looking in terms of death rates per 100,000, African Americans have a death rate on average at about 20 per 100,000. Whites have a death rate of about 10 per 100,000. So the African American death rate is on average twice as high as it is for white folks in New York City. But when you look at some specific neighborhoods, say in Brooklyn, and I really just focused in Brooklyn, the neighborhood with the highest death rate from the coronavirus is East New York, Start City. It has a death rate of about 612 per 100,000. So if we just said 600 per 100,000, that is 60 times the rate, 60 times the rate of coronavirus deaths from of an average for white folks in New York City. And if you look really closely at a community like East New York, Start City, what you see are a large number of the underlying comorbidities. So folks are older, they're poorer, it's a food desert. You know, there's an increased incidence of obesity, the increased incidence of hypertension, increased incidence of diabetes, which we sort of tried to ideate around kind of how do we support. So I think what the coronavirus is revealing to us is in a sense how not equitable we are. And so it's really making it very, very clear. And so when you think about what the implications there are for our communities, and then by extension our schools and children who are coming to the various schools in those communities, we can see how deeply problematic it is. And we can see how difficult it is too, as folks have already described, how difficult it is for us to create a sense of fairness so that, you know, the students don't feel overwhelmed, they don't feel like their community is overwhelmed, to create a systemic approach to things so that we're ensuring that we are not as Angel Martinez just said, you know, we're not focusing on one thing, we're not just focusing on disproportionality, but we're creating a holistic approach which meets people where they are and then moves them in a direction that does not, and I think this is very, very important, which Shoieb mentioned, you know, that we are not in the moment, we can't, and this is what it's saying to us, we can't align the expectations for everyone. We see that in this moment. We see how critical it is for us to be educated. We say all of us to be educated. Someone who is not educated, yes, someone who, that's the whole point. We are all connected. We see this very, very clearly now, and so we have to, as Principal Shoieb just noted, we have to ensure that everyone, we have these expectations for everyone. Right. And now the challenge for us is to say, how do we, as Angel Martinez said, how do we create the structural environment so that we ensure that everyone meets? And I think that that's what it means to say equity from my standpoint. And I think I'm much closer to that, much more resonant with that, having gone through this experience and seen what this experience has meant for, you know, for us in the City University of New York. We, you know, we literally went from coming to classes in the room, but 2 weeks later, everyone got shifted online. You know, we're working in an institution where, you know, many of the students are non-traditional students, folks who are coming from, you know, economically challenged environments, just all of a sudden now having to get up to, you know, I need to have a computer, I need to have effective Wi-Fi access, I need to have a proper space in my apartment where I can work. And all of those things are part of this sort of, you know, equity challenge that you've described, Dr. Bartholomew. And I think that, you know, we're working our way through this, and I trust that we will have to continue to work and to really think rigorously about what's happening here.
And it is the work. Thank you so much, Dr. Blackman. It is the work, right? And it is the work that we've all been engaged in. And as I think about this, you know, before, as the news was kind of rolling out the COVID-19, and we see so much of the press conferences, I'm I'm always having discussions about how people show up. So if our leaders weren't really showing up, right? You might have been, physically there, and we might have been watching you on the television, but are you truly showing up for our communities? Because when you say that there's a virus that impacts people with a weak immune system, that impacts people with heart, hypertension and the elderly, right? Why were we not showing up for those people and say, wait a minute, Co-op City has one of the largest elderly population in the city of New York. We need to direct resources there, right? And so how we show up is really, to me, what this discussion is about. For those who are joining us, thank you for joining us. This is our community conversations with leaders. Please make sure you like and you subscribe. We look forward to this continued conversation with you. So I want to ask this question about showing up. How do you show up? How do you show up? And how must we now show up, maybe, as leaders in this space, not just in East New York, in Jersey, and Harlem? How will we now, as leaders, have to show up for our parents and for our community? Principal Shoieb, how do we show up?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, when I think about showing up, first of all, I'm always in it, right? I'm always thinking about my staff, my students, my parents. So I love to give 150%. I'm showing up physically, whether it's going into the school if I need to. And there have been times, especially in the last few weeks, that I have been physically going into the buildings to either meet with social distancing, of course. Let me put that out there.
Yes.
Where we will have our meetings on the front lawn of our school, sometimes with my phenomenal PTA or some of my leaders. I refer to my leaders as my teachers, because everyone in my building is a leader in their own right. And they all have strengths that they bring to the table. So showing up either physically, in person, or virtually. Every week, I try my best to make sure that I'm either checking in with my staff as a whole faculty. Typically on Fridays, I like to do a positivity check-in where we just get on a Google Meet and we share something positive that's happening. Because right now, so many of us are faced with our own personal traumas, right? And then we're going through this virtual experience that we're kind of building as we go along, because there's so much uncertainty. It's the first time that we're experiencing this. So I try to check in at least once a week with my staff in a whole group, and then also in small group, because that's very important. I need to hear from them, and I also need to see them.
Mm-hmm.
In regards to my students, checking in also through Google Meets. Many of my leaders will invite me to virtual sessions where I get to drop in and I see the students and they get so excited. And I say to them, Ms. Shoieb loves you. I'm here. I give you a virtual hug. I'm big on the virtual hugging thing because I miss my 400 hugs a day that I was getting from my 661 students.
Okay.
So I miss all of them so much. I'm in a pre-K through grade 6 bilingual building, and so I really miss them also very much. But checking in with them, and then also parents showing up, whether it's a phone call to say, hey, how are you doing? How can I best support you? I think all of those pieces are a part of showing up.
Thank you. Thank you. And it goes back once again to relationships, right? Once again to relationships.
Absolutely.
Right? You have to have had those relationships before you go into a virtual building. And I say that because I want to, as we have this discussion, I want to make sure it's an authentic conversation, right? We have a lot of families that are not connected right now and don't have access to Wi-Fi. We have schools, we have children who are in juvenile detention centers, and they're not allowed, right, to have those resources. And we're hoping to have a community conversation with the corrections department in the next couple of months so that they can then share what are they doing. But it's important to recognize that I'm nervous about the fact that maybe it's going to work. The whole virtual piece will push us, yes, in terms of that digital divide and close it. But for our most vulnerable, that it's almost, there's the fracturedness about it, because we do want the hug and we do want to feel connected, right? And so how do we truly do remain connected in, in this space? So I want to ask Equity Director Martinez, talk to us a little bit about HREP and what does it mean to show up for some of your parents? What are some very concrete things that you've been engaged with around supporting your parents at Harlem Renaissance Education Pipeline?
Yes, hi. So yes, I feel like we luckily, although we are 3 people between Dr. Sandio, Cynthia, and myself, I think we've done a great job so far in realizing that we all 3 bring something different to the table and have areas of work and areas of impact that we can focus on so that we can maximize our small little team to reach these big, spaces and to meet these big needs. So one thing that I think has been very powerful was the District 5 collaborative that we did to meet the needs of families who were in desperate need of like food and also some resources like cleaning supplies and masks, gloves, things like that that are really essential for, at this point, like survival. Because we are in New York City and we are in Harlem, and the numbers don't work in our favor in that sense for our community, which is predominantly Black. And so being able to be a part of that team and being really attentive and having them take the lead, I really can't praise Cynthia and Dr. Sandy enough for really going back to who are our partners? How do we put all of this together? How do we coordinate it? What are the right conversations to have? Who are the right people to have at the table? And are we really tapping into the correct resources that's meeting the needs of our community? And then we have, the education piece and the parent engagement piece, which is that what are the spaces that we're in? It was usually me because I'm the parent, and particularly the parent of the district. So having separate conversations in other spaces where there are parents to be able to talk to them and see what their needs are, and realizing that a lot of times those spaces are really the place to have conversations with them that is checking in with them and that is not school-based and making it seem like the only time that I care about you is when I need you to perform on a school level or on an academic level. And that has been very important. And just not making it so virtual, asking for social distance, conversations and walking out in our neighborhood because we are in the same district. And that has been it really allowed me to see that people are responsive to that. So that way, when I go back to the spaces of schools and they're like, parents aren't showing up. And I'm like, actually they are, but how are we showing up for them? And we have had some makeup nights, some virtual makeup nights to where we can just, virtual happy hours incorporated with that as well. So that's just been a time to just let your hair down and just really be parent to parent without that piece. And the other part of it is the work that we were doing as the District 5 equity team, which we are getting back into. Tomorrow is our first meeting in a long time. And that is the space that we have used that we feel has already been established and where we have relationships and connections and these conversations have already started. So people are coming in to really give us some authentic feedback, to really, dig into like what's going on for them, what has the experience been like, and how do we take that space as far as some next steps into building out to making connections with other schools that haven't been a part of that conversation.
Thank you, thank you. And I love the idea of saying equity spaces and to recognize that those have to be crafted, those have to be designed. And I'm not talking about decoration either. I'm not talking about the things that we do, just to have the photo up or just to be able to, send out the notice saying, oh, yeah, we had a meeting, right? That's just decoration. But to truly craft a space of equity, you have to now really focus on relationships. And at Legacy, we talk about relationships. They have to norm, they have to perform, they have to storm. And you have to have those structures in place, because once again, I'm going to go back to that in place, out of place. If the adults are feeling out of place, right? And we work with adults who also feel out of place. Let's be honest about what they're feeling. And when people are out of place, we act on fear. And, we don't necessarily have learned how to have hard conversations about relationships, about equity, where people might feel, oh, what do you mean? I was sharing earlier that as a business owner, of color, a Black woman, people think that when I'm fighting for fair contract rates, they think, oh, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? And those are not easy conversations for people to have with me as an entrepreneur, as I try to move the business forward. So in that space, it has to be well crafted, and it requires leadership and a commitment to it. I want to kind of go to there's a second part. You want to comment on that, Aleya? I see you. Yes?
Yeah, Doc, I just wanted to comment real quick, because I think that as educators, it's very important that we're transparent with our families. And when I think about building relationships with my families, I share the personal, I'm
Yes.
personal, I'm vulnerable with them, and I'm transparent. And I think that definitely enables them to be vulnerable and transparent with me. I need to know what's going on so I can best help you. And the only way to be that is just to be honest, right? And so I share some of my own personal stories with them, which really helps me connect to those families so that they know, like, yeah, I really am here for you. I really am here. I want what's best for you. And we're in this together. We're going to do this work together.
Thank you for that. That is a very concrete strategy, and it takes risk taking to do that. It takes risk taking, and you're able to take the risk because you're in place. Right? I'm being honest about that, because I see what's happening in the world today. And I think we're not being honest about the fact that people truly do feel out of place, and they might be going through the motions and having the conversation about change. But when it now asks them to show up, that if they're feeling disconnected or whatever, they're not going to be able to really move this agenda forward. Dr. Blackman, talk to us a little bit, and I want to get to Principal Shoieb talked about trauma. So I'm going to hold that a minute. I want to talk about this question about the fact that our children have been out of school for at least 4 months. I have a beautiful godson, Aiden. I spoke to him today. He was like, he's done. He's absolutely done. He's 9 years old. And I understand. I say that to his mom. He has every right to unplug right now. Okay. They're done with you. They don't want to be bothered anymore. They don't want another, worksheet online, whatever it is. They're done. They haven't seen their friends. They haven't played basketball. They are done. Okay. So if you're listening, if you're a mom, have compassion for yourself right now. It's okay to admit that, right? Like, let's bake some cookies. Let's do something different. Let's go and, ride the bike around the block. Don't keep trying to do the same thing and hold the line. It's not going to work for you too much longer, right? Have compassion. So I want to talk a minute, Dr. Blackman, around this context of the fact that our children has missed several, months off school, and our parents must be very nervous about getting them ready. And given the work that we know about mathematics and the fact that our kids struggle so much. So what are you concerned about, and what are you thinking in the context of kind of like back to basics as we now look ahead at the summertime? And in New York, I just heard that they're not necessarily opening up the summer camps. New Jersey said that they're going to open, but New York seems to not, I don't know if it's a final word as of yet, but I'm not sure if the camps in New York City are going to open. So now what does that truly mean in terms of getting our kids ready and for back to basics and to close that gap that they just,
Yeah,
Go ahead,
I do think that, I do think this is a real issue. I mean, so first, let me say one way in which I've been thinking about it is, thinking about the class of students who enter college, in the fall. So in a sense, they will have had, maybe 4 or 5 months of things that they ought to have been thinking about, but are not there. So, from the perspective of the college, I've been thinking about ways in which we can begin to create an environment, create some structures that might mitigate against the sort of learning loss that is inevitable from this kind of thing. I do think that, this is not only just about kids coming to the college, but it's about kids going into the next grade. And so I think we will have to be prepared for, doing for making some adjustments at the beginning of our semester and beginning to think about what we can do now. Because, you know, again, I go back to this, you know, if you allow me to just return to the previous question about, you know, how must we show up? In a sense,
Absolutely.
this is about how we show up. And what we now know is that it is not going to be acceptable for a number of kids to be left to lag, to use it. And so we now need to be very, very serious about, okay, what is our plan for this? And in a sense, this is about how we show up. And we, you know, we know there is going to be some learning loss. There are going to be issues. We are already dealing with individuals who are, you know, coming from some non-traditional circumstances, who will have had sort of challenges even before this.
Even
emerged,
before this,
right?
Exactly.
So for us to, you know, and this is the turn that we need, and I commend you on this. For us, as we think about this today, we ought to be thinking, what are we building for these young people in July? What are we building for them in August? And what are we building for them in September? And you know, we still have the challenge of thinking, are they all going to be in school? Are we going to be in school? How are we going to be in school? Are we going to be able to manage the health issues well? And so this is also a second point, which I want to make. I think the question about how must we show up is really important. And I wanted to sort of emphasize that really part of what, and this has been reflected in Aleya's comments and in Angel's comments around empowering the people around you and sort of finding ways to empower people, because we see now the critical importance of having teams. You know, no individual can respond to these kinds of, so we will be better if we are better as a team. And so, you know, how we show up and how we manage this question of learning loss will be something that we have to do collectively. It's not something that we're going to be able to do on an individual basis. We will need our health expertise, we will need pedagogical expertise, we will need a parental expertise, across the full spectrum. And it's going to be whether or not, as sort of Angel sort of rightly, whether or not we're going to be able to bring people together in an authentic way that is not about, like you just said, the show work, you know, just kind of doing something because you want to write something and send it. This way of doing business is no longer appropriate. We can see that it is completely and utterly a failed way of doing business, and we have to do business in a very, very serious way now.
Thank you. And I think we have been doing so much of the decoration, right? Our schools have set plans, and you're right, we're supposed to have teams, but are we truly
but are we truly acting in the team? Are we truly being rigorous in our analysis of the data? Are we truly being rigorous in understanding the relationships and really talking honestly and about the challenges that we face and about how we solve those challenges? Yeah.
And I think as for myself as a company and us being in this space for 12 years now, moving into our second decade, our work is all about a pedagogy of voice and confidence. And so for us, this is actually a two-part conversation. For those who are joining us, join us again tomorrow at 4 o'clock, because we're having a back to basic conversation with Kathleen Hermitage and Barbara Fields around this, why our kids are struggling in math, struggling in writing, and what do we do to close the gap. So we have actually launched our back to basic camp for the summer. And we think that our kids need the opportunity to now have some very targeted intervention around the skills, right? And so whereas everybody went into the online space and they wanted to do the same thing that they were always doing, which wasn't working anyway, right? So if you're that kid, right, and you just now, right, you now put me in an online environment, and it was the perfect opportunity to say, no, let's just stop and let's give you what you need. So when you come back in September, you could feel confident about it because you just had trauma. You just had, right, this significant challenge. And so for us as a company right now, it is back to basics, but we're not saying basics in the sense of rudimentary arithmetic. We're talking about giving our children what they need right now to be successful successful in this space because they are dealing with trauma. I'm mindful of the time. I know we've got questions from the audience. Principal Shoieb, I want you to answer the question. I know we didn't get to truly unpack this question about trauma and secondary trauma, but I think it matters in the context of how we're going to show up for our kids, because when I experience trauma and secondary trauma, it impacts how I learn academically, which is why we need to focus, right, on those basic core things and how they integrate. So can you just define it for us and what we need to know and understand about trauma and secondary trauma in this context today?
Yes, absolutely. So when I think about trauma, I think about adverse childhood experiences and what some of those experiences are that our students might be faced with. So we're talking about neglect, abandonment, abuse, divorce, separation of a parent, mental illness in the household. Right now, it could be around economic hardship. So those are some of the adverse childhood experiences that some of our children might be experiencing in their household virtually. I mean, we know this in building our relationships with our families and children, that when they come to school, many of their stories, their narratives are shared with us. So we begin to build those relationships and we begin to see what are the needs of each specific child, family, and how do we equitably meet those needs. When it comes to secondary traumatic stress, oftentimes we think about that. When I first started really diving into this particular focus, and this is what I'm doing my dissertation study around, examining the emotional impact of burnout, secondary traumatic stress on the educator in particular. Because when we think about secondary traumatic stress, it is really the stress that we are encountering from the trauma that our students are bringing into the classrooms and listening to those accounts of trauma, okay? And then some of the symptoms are really similar to PTSD, and we have to be mindful of that. So in having conversations with colleagues, with teachers, I know that they may not have been able to put a name on it, but now as we're having those conversations, it's like, oh yeah, I am experiencing that. I didn't know what it was, but yes, I am getting flashbacks. I am having sleepless nights. I am getting, I am having this sense of anxiety over what my student just shared with me. Yeah. And we really need to be mindful of that and create a space for our teachers to be able to have conversations around their feelings and how they're feeling. Because many times as leaders, we feel like, okay, I'm that superhero, right?
Exactly.
I got
parents. We have to be that too, right?
Right? I have to walk into that building. And even for me, I'm like, okay, I'm the leader of the building. I have to be strong. But you know what? Strength is showing emotion. Being able to share with my teachers, yes, that is affecting me. I am experiencing this level of emotional distress as well. I might not show it, but in small group conversation, I am sharing that with them. And then how do we best support our teachers move past this? We have to really think about being mindful of that and really getting them to sharpen their saw, being mindful of what their emotional needs are as well. That piece of it is very important.
Well said, right? Because we're all experiencing it as adults. I think also we have to be honest. There are certain things historically that impact how we think about the word trauma, and then also culturally, right? Because you're constantly told, culturally, pull up, what's wrong with you? Why you can't get over that, right? Keep it moving, right? This is why, because when you're experiencing so much pain on a regular basis, right? It's this idea of kind of like, keep your hands on the plow and just keep pushing through, which is not easy. And let's be honest about the fact that it's not working. It's not working because people feel out of place and they check out. So this conversation for me really matters, because I do think it is trauma when you keep showing the murder of a Black man, right? 8 minutes and 46, right? Seconds. And yes, we are being mobile about it, but it is still trauma. And to become a responsive curriculum, a truly culturally responsive curriculum for me is, come September, in our math classes, are we going to talk about the cost of COVID? And are we going to talk about this, right? And be able to have those conversations in this, in this space to be truly responsive. So I'm mindful of the time. I do see a couple of questions. I want to ask Equity Dr. Martinez, talk to us a little bit about the culturally responsiveness in this space as you think about the equity space, and what would that conversation look like, or what would you want it to look like for, you said you have 3 children at home, but for each and every child in District 5, and for those who are listening in the audience.
Yes, so I'll be very quick with this part and try to answer.
That's okay, it's a complex question, it's all right.
But so I do want to say that the definition for culturally responsive sustaining education was adopted by the Department of Education, but it came from a working group of parents, community members, students, and consultants who sat around, and we really workshopped this pager. And there's one sentence that we all go to whenever it gets trivial or whenever the rhetoric comes out, that I want to read very quickly out of it, which is culturally responsive sustaining education uses educational strategies that leverage the various aspects of students' identities, including the rich culture, racial, historical, linguistic characteristics of students, to provide mirrors that reflect the greatness of who their people are, and windows into the world that allow students to connect across cultures. And I really want that to set the foundation and the premise for what these conversations look like now, because that is extremely important right now. And I'm very thankful for my working group, because they prepared me for this time of COVID and of the late George Floyd, and what is happening right now in our city, and these big conversations that I mentioned earlier. I have seen such a disconnect with my children's education and the topics that they are discussing compared to the realities that they're living right now. And it forced me to have a conversation and essentially create a different curriculum. And when I say create a different curriculum, it's been a verbal and oral curriculum. So I don't want people to feel overwhelmed, like, I don't have those types of skills to write out like these different units, a rubric. It's not that language. It was simply sitting down with them and stating, like, protests are happening because X, Y, Z. And also making sure that I'm not using language that's not digestible for them, but being very clear that I too went through this when I was their age, looking at the Rodney King verdict and things that happened during that time, and a lot of similarities that they're living through right now. And then with COVID, talking about like the HIV and AIDS epidemic that happened in the 80s, and how like powerful social agents played a role in that, like TV shows, the misinformation that came out at first, the importance of researching. And I noticed that they were so into the conversations and they were so attentive. But then I go to check my daughter's homework and she's learning about the Vikings. And I'm just like, this is such an opportunity.
Exactly.
but I think about like how many other
conversations with leaders. That's why we're having this conversation. This is why we're here. We're having an authentic and honest conversation. For those who are listening, we're being honest about this. And if we're not honest about it, we are not showing up for our children. Absolutely.
And it also says like how ill-prepared we are and how we're not centering our identities. And do we feel like we have the room to do so? So if your curriculum is a certain way, this is a moment to say, we need to scrap this, or we need to make sure that these are interchangeable and living documents that we can just pull in certain pieces that make sense for all of us as a school community, as a classroom community, and just reassess along the way. Because I think that students, that parents at home are the teachers now. They've always been the teachers, but they are like the academic teachers in that sense. But I think that we as adults have shared history together that we live through, that we can attest to, and that we can loan our voices to You know, and part of our culture is storytelling. So
Yes.
how are we bringing that, and how are we making it live in the lives of the young people who are in our lives, and reflecting as adults?
And that's exactly why we're here today. For those who are with us online, thank you so much for joining us for our community conversations. Please make sure you like the channel, subscribe. This is part one. And so tomorrow, again, June 10th at 4 p.m., we're having another discussion, back to basics, talking very directly about why our kids are struggling in math, why they're struggling in writing, and what are those very concrete things that we need to do. And as I mentioned, as a company, we're focusing on back to basics, math, writing, and also financial literacy, right? Because we didn't even touch this discussion that this economic justice, right, for our children. So we're doing some things on blockchain and cryptocurrency because, hello, culturally responsiveness, if you can't get your PPP and you can't trace where the money is, right, then there's a problem. So we need to really rethink what we're doing. And it's unfortunate because we have, I was very encouraged because yesterday there was a march in New York City of educators who were protesting and saying we need something different, right? And we don't want to just, it's not just about scrapping and burning, right? This is about also empowering our teachers with the skills that they need, the relationships, the content, and the pedagogy. That's what we talk about, a tripod to be able to truly empower them. And so you can't just toss everything out. You need expectations, as Principal Shoieb was saying, that those expectations matter. So for those who are still with us, if you want to put up your questions, I know I'm mindful of the time, and I want to kind of have the opportunity to close out with this dynamic panel. I feel like if we could talk another hour,
Yes.
I think we could continue this conversation because we just barely scratched the culturally responsiveness, right? So I'm going to ask, closing discussion. So I want to maybe ask, what assumptions are we making about culturally responsiveness as we close? I'm going to let Dr. Blackman go, and I'm mindful of the time, and then Equity Director Martinez, and then Principal Shoieb. So for my closeout question to you, Dr. Blackman, what assumptions do you think people are making about culturally responsive curriculum? And certainly if you can make that connection in the context of math and STEM.
Okay, so so as you know, I've thought a lot about the underrepresentation of African Americans in mathematics, and this is the kind of thing that has persisted. It's well documented. It's persisted despite multiple varied efforts over years too, and so part of what I think we're displaced now, where we understand that really this is not about closing achievement gaps. It's not about making moral arguments. These things are insufficient. We now see in as literal a sense as that the equity and access issues that are at play are embedded in histories of oppression and the devaluation of Black people in the nation. You can't run away from it. It is what it is. And we see it starkly. Yesterday I attended a protest for some of the young students and one of the young students cried. And so she was asking for Black excellence. And she cried. This was the chant, Black excellence, Black excellence. And she cried. And I think that that's what we understand now. So yes, we have to have strategies, but we have to embrace the fact that, we're here not just randomly. We're here because, we've lived the history of oppression and devaluation of Black people, and we have to face that squarely. And I think as we face that, just as has been described, we have to affirm and we have to draw upon the cultural resources of the various communities. We have to embrace them. We have to not be afraid to embrace the cultural resources of communities, because it's as you do that, as you begin to have these sort of culturally resonant approaches, that I think you begin to develop these robust math and science identities that can move our communities forward. And I will say more as a researcher of mathematics. I think that, once you begin to embrace these cultural questions, I'll close with this. My research has to do with, trying to figure out, if you heard a drum being played, could you tell me what shape it was just based on the sound? So if you were standing outside the door and I hit the drum, could you tell me if it was a circle, it was a square, it was a rectangle, it was,
wow.
So, you know, I took this question and I struggled a lot with this question. And finally, I met a drummer of an African drummer. And I asked him about this. And he said, you know, we don't play a single drum. We play many drums.
Oh.
And so I went to a famous mathematician and I said, could you hear an ensemble of drums? And he said, Terrence, that's such a difficult question. And I realized how the difficult questions are in tune with the cultural dynamic, but because you're so divorced from it, you never ever ask it. Because you're always running away. You're always studying Vikings rather than something else. And so I think that for me is where we need to engage our children in in the highest level of
thinking,
academic endeavor that they can be a part of. That has to be our goal. And we have to say that you can do that by embracing yourself. You don't have to become someone else in order to be a mathematician or a physicist or a computer science. You can be Terrence Blackman.
And show up as yourself.
And show up as yourself.
Thank you, Dr. Blackman. Thank you so much. Thank you for that. Ms. Martinez, Equity Director Martinez, talk to us about the assumptions we are making about culturally responsive curriculum.
Just one? Are we talking about? No.
We're gonna have to come back. We're gonna definitely, this is a series we're doing, community conversations for the year, just so that people know Dr. B, we and my team, we bring it. And so we have actually mapping out the entire year. So yes, we welcome the opportunity to come back to this. So tell us in the few minutes we have, tell us what assumptions, just one.
Yes. So I will say the biggest assumption that I see, which also creates the biggest deficit within culturally responsive education, is the fact that it has nothing to do with math or science, or culturally responsive education only lives in social studies. And that misconception has allowed schools to create a learning gap and a pitfall that is so deep that oftentimes they can't get themselves out of it.
Thank you so much. Ms. Shoieb, one assumption that we're making.
Yeah, I love what Dr. Blackman and Director Martinez shared. I will say that one assumption would be, you know, if we hold a multicultural event, that's it, we're culturally responsive, that's enough. We really need to look at that. It's not just based off of one event. It's based off how we are embedding cultural responsiveness in everything that we do, all of our practices, so that our students see themselves in books, in the work, in the tasks. So that piece of it is very important. And that's one assumption that I'd like to share.
Thank you. For me, my assumption is that you could buy it in a bottle. You can buy it and you can just purchase it. And, you know, and like I said, I am an entrepreneur. This is a space that I fight every day to be in. And the word on the street is that they're about ready to buy it, and they're going to put some Black and brown and Asian and Latino faces in it, and parcel it off and say to our parents that this is culturally responsive when it's not. You have to have authentic individuals at the table who understand the different communities, right? And who understand the diversity and the strengths. And I love that mirror, to be able to look in at someone and want to welcome them into your space and to want to be invited into their space. So it's not something that you can buy in a bottle. So if you're a parent, you know, there's some deeper things that has to take place first before you can roll out something. You have to spend time, as we've been talking, around relationships. And for Legacy as a company, we talk about the fact that we refuse, this is about ending the social reproduction of failure. So you have to stop reproducing failure. You've got to know what success looks like in different cultures. And you have to be able to go after success models in order to engage our children in a different way. I'm excited. I want to say thank you. Thank you, Dr. Blackman. Thank you, Equity Director Martinez. Thank you so much. Thank you, Principal Shoieb. I want to also say hello to our fans in Canada. For those who are listening live from Canada today, thank you so much. This is Community Conversations with Legacy. Our next Legacy webinar, we're actually doing another one tomorrow, same time, 4 p.m. You can connect through the Dr. Selma B Show channel on YouTube. And And thank you for joining us. The video will be available. Please make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. I promise you, I don't send out a lot of emails and all of those things. And I just want to wish everyone a wonderful day. I know that it is a solemn time in the country, but I want you to know that with love and with care, that we will be in place and that we will help our children to be in place. And so on that note, thank you again for joining us. Thank you to our panel and thank you to our audience.